I was a woman dying from a terminal illness. But to the man I loved, I was nothing. Even when I was alone in a hospital bed, begging for help, he was too busy fooling around with someone else.
In a private hospital in Hai Chen, Tony Carmel snapped the medical file shut, his face stern. Julia Lopez forced a faint smile. "Please keep my condition confidential," she said. Julia Lopez gripped the icy handrail as she made her way down. "Tell Jason Smith about her illness? Forget it. He was the same boy from 9 years ago now. He couldn't stand the sight of her." Julia Lopez stood at the hospital's entrance, watching snowflakes tumble down. She pulled her scarf tighter inside softly. At the bus stop, she took out the diagnosis slip, stared at it for a second, then tossed it into the trash can. Back home, she poured out a handful of colorful pills and swallowed them with warm water. The heater hummed to life, and finally, warmth seeped into her bones. Julia Lopez dialed that all-too-familiar number. Once. Twice. By the 8th try, the line finally connected. Her eyes lit up instantly, and her voice cracked with emotion. Jason Smith frowned as the woman's voice came through the phone. "Never seen snow before? You're in your 20s, try acting like it." "I'm hanging up." Julia Lopez spoke carefully. "Tomorrow's New Year's Day. You'll be at home." Jason Smith hung up mid-sentence. The dial tone buzzed in her ears as she slid down to the cold floor, shoulder shaking, sobs spilling out. Jason Smith didn't return until a full week later. Julia Lopez hadn't expected it. When she saw him at the door, the pills in her palm suddenly felt scalding hot. Without sparing her a glance, Jason Smith walked straight to the study. Julia Lopez hurried to put away the pills and rushed after him. Just as she reached the door, it opened. Jason Smith stepped out holding a file. Julia Lopez froze, unsure how to react. Jason Smith looked at her frail figure and frowned. "Who are you putting on this act for?" Julia Lopez caught the disgust in his eyes and blurted out, "No." "Jason Smith, I went to the hospital." His phone rang. A soft female voice came through clearly. "President Jason, the banquet is about to start." He murmured a reply, but Julia Lopez could hear the tenderness in his tone. Jason Smith brushed past her, picked up his bag, and said coldly, "If you're sick, go see a doctor. Don't come to me. I can't fix you." The door slammed shut behind him. Julia Lopez whispered into the emptiness, "I did see a doctor. He couldn't fix it either." Silence closed in around her. Only the wind and snow tapping at the windows answered her like the quiet sobs of a woman. Julia Lopez never liked this city. When it snowed, it never stopped. The sky stayed gray and heavy, just like her heart. At the hospital again, Julia Lopez looked at Tony Carmel holding her report. "Has anything changed?" she asked softly. Tony Carmel set the report down, fingers laced, his tone grave. Julia Lopez nodded. No way she was telling a near stranger she couldn't afford chemo. That life-extending treatment was out of reach. After crunching the numbers, she realized she could only afford 6 months' worth of meds. Meanwhile, Jason Smith held his gentle, doe-eyed secretary Latina Mera in his arms. For a split second, he thought of Julia Lopez's pale and fragile face. The thought annoyed him. Under the covers, Latina Mera purred, "President Jason, I want more." Jason Smith raised an eyebrow, smirking. "What?" Still not satisfied. Latina Mera's sweet voice pulled him into a haze. Julia Lopez used to smile at him like that too. But over time, their relationship had turned into just routine. Jason Smith shook the thought off, rolled over, and pinned Latina Mera beneath him. With her, he could let loose, be wild, be as reckless and rough as he wanted. Back in the apartment, Julia Lopez returned to an empty home. She sighed so softly, it was almost inaudible. She flipped through the calendar, her fingers paused. That date was coming again. She picked up her phone and called Jason Smith. "When are you coming back?" "It's almost my parents' Memorial Day." Jason Smith sat up. Latina Mera curled in his arms like a kitten. Julia Lopez's call only made him feel she lacked charm. Julia Lopez paused for 2 seconds, then said firmly, "Jason Smith, you have to come back." She rarely spoke to him like that. But when it came to her bottom lines, she never backed down. Her parents had disapproved of Jason Smith from the start. If she visited their graves alone, she feared they wouldn't rest easy. Jason Smith went quiet, then snapped, "Can you stop using your parents to guilt-trip me?" Julia Lopez felt her breath catch. His impatience stabbed into her chest like needles. At that moment, Latina Mara let out a soft cry. She'd ogged her hair by accident. Jason Smith glared at her, then muttered toward the silent phone, a flicker of guilt in his voice. Fine. You'll come back." Julia Lopez's heart clenched like a fist was squeezing it. The woman's voice on the other end had been crystal clear. After the call ended, Julia Lopez returned to her room. She sat down, wrapped herself tightly in a blanket, and finally let the sobs she had held back pour out, soft and broken. The air under the blanket was stifling. Julia Lopez tugged it down, revealing a tear-streaked face. Her eyes wouldn't stop leaking like broken faucets. In the hotel room, Jason Smith shoved Latina Mara aside and gripped her chin. "Don't even think about scheming your way up. No one takes my wife's place." As he left without looking back, Latina Mara clutched her stomach, seething with hate. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Jason Smith drove aimlessly through the city. The more he thought of Julia Lopez's unyielding attitude, the more it irked him. Everyone else bent over backward to please him, but not her. After all these years, her calm detachment made her feel flavorless, like flat soda. Lost in thought, he didn't even see the red light of the truck barreling through the intersection. Julia Lopez got the call and rushed to the hospital, still in her house clothes. She grabbed an nurse. "Excuse me, the man from the car accident, where is he?" The nurse glanced at her anxious face and hesitated, then pointed down the hallway. Julia Lopez followed her gaze and froze. Jason Smith stood there, clothes slightly messy, but completely unharmed. Beside him, a perfectly made-up woman leaned on him with a face full of fear. Julia Lopez's stomach twisted. She reached for the nearby nurse to steady herself. The nurse panicked, but Julia Lopez waved her off and turned to flee the hospital. It was the first time she'd seen Jason Smith with another woman so clear, so close. Her mind blanked. All she could think about was getting out. Jason Smith seemed to sense something and turned. All he saw was a figure running away. He stood abruptly and said to his secretary, "Give me your car keys," then paused. "Never mind. You stay here. He'll cover all her medical bills." When he finally burst through the front door, he saw Julia Lopez crouched in the entryway, pale as snow. She looked up at the sound, her eyes hollow, like all life had been drained from her. Jason Smith opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. Julia Lopez shoved him away, her voice cracking. "Why did you let me see that? You knew the hospital would call me. You knew." He couldn't remember the last time Julia Lopez looked like this. Her nose was red from the cold, and suddenly, guilt hit him like a truck. He cupped her cheek and whispered, "Julia, don't be mad." Real panic flickered in his eyes. Julia Lopez's heart softened instantly. Just then, Jason Smith's phone lit up. One glance and his face changed. She saw tension, anger. Her mind flashed back to that woman at the hospital. Something felt wrong. Jason Smith muttered something, then rushed out the door. Julia Lopez threw on her heavy coat and ran after him. She watched him speed off in his car, flagged a cab, and followed. What she didn't expect was that she'd had gone back to the hospital to that woman. He stood there, saying something. The woman cradled her still flat belly with both hands. Julia Lopez's gaze turned cold. She spun around and bumped into her doctor, Tony Kamal. She pulled him aside. "Can I still have a baby?" she asked flatly. Tony Kamal frowned. His tone turned firm. Julia Lopez's voice rose, shaky and urgent. "I have to get pregnant. If you can't help me, I'll find someone who can. Tony Como glanced around, his voice shut for once. You're free to switch doctors, but let me remind you, life only gives you one shot. Julia Lopez's eyes turned red. What do you know? She shouted, then ran out of the hospital. From afar, she saw them standing together. Her legs gave out, and she leaned against the wall, fighting back the rising sorrow. Still, tears blurred her vision. Jason Smith, after 9 years? How did we end up like this? Her frozen fingers trembled as she typed a message. Somewhere else, Jason Smith watched Latina Mara sobbing. His voice turned cold. Abort it. Latina Mara. Jason Smith knew the rumors. A successful man his age with no children. People would talk. Say he was broken, but he didn't care. Outside flings were just that, flings. The real one. There was only ever one. So no one, not even Latina Mara, would have his child. Latina Mara's eyes went wide. After all she'd done, this man could still be this cruel? Her gaze darted to the far corner. Her body shook with rage. Jason Smith didn't notice. He just looked down at his phone and said, "I'll book you the appointment right now." His words cut off. He stared at the message on his screen, pupils contracting. 7 simple words, Jason Smith.
It had been a week. Jason Smith never replied to her message, never came home. Julia Lopez couldn't guess what he was thinking, so she gave up trying. But the nosebleeds were getting worse. Clumps of hair fell out by the handful. The pain in her bones left her clinging to alcohol for relief. In the bar, Julia Lopez's unfocused gaze drifted over the crowd on the dance floor, men and women bursting with life and energy. Things she used to have. Her vitality had long withered away. Whatever passion she had left, she gave it all to Jason Smith. Now, all that remained was a body on the verge of rotting. Julia Lopez curled her lips into a faint smile and downed her drink in one gulp. Just as she was about to order another, a familiar voice stopped her. Tony Como stared coldly at her. In his eyes, Julia Lopez was never a good woman. She seemed to sense his judgment. Maybe it was the heat, maybe the buzz. Or maybe the alcohol finally hit. She lost her usual calm and started talking. "I know you don't like me. Honestly, I don't like this version of me either. But I'm angry. I'm bitter. I was with my husband for 9 years. And what do I get? He knocked up another woman, and I got a terminal illness. Call it karma. I didn't listen to the older generation. Chased after some damn fairy tale love. So out of spite, I filed for divorce. Doctor, tell me, don't I deserve to die?" Tony Como pressed his lips together. He hadn't expected to hear any of this. Julia Lopez looked at him, eyes filled with sorrow. "Doctor, I don't want to die. I'm too ashamed to face my dead parents. But I can't live either, because I'm broke. You get it? I'm not afraid of chemo, just can't afford it." She collapsed against the bar and broke down sobbing. The pride she'd built over the years shattered completely. Tony Como looked at the woman in front of him, eyes dark. He let out a slow breath. "There's always a way. As long as you tell me you want to live." Jason Smith parked downstairs. Thinking of the message Julia Lopez sent, his chest tightened with rage. Clearly, she didn't care. She really filed for divorce that easily? Just because he played a little too rough outside? Jason Smith rolled down the window and took a hard drag on his cigarette. It was just for fun. He never planned on leaving Julia Lopez. Headlights flickered in the distance. Jason Smith looked over and froze. In the passenger seat of that approaching car was Julia Lopez. "Thank you for tonight, Dr. Tony." Julia Lopez said politely as she stepped out. "No problem. Come to the hospital tomorrow. I'll get you something for the pain." Tony Como offered a rare smile. Swallowing back the pity in his chest, he turned and drove off. Julia Lopez watched the taillights disappear. Just as she turned to go upstairs, a large hand grabbed her and slammed her against the wall. Jason Smith's eyes were bloodshot, his voice seething. "You really hooked up with another man?" Julia Lopez clutched her aching waist and muttered through gritted teeth, "He's a doctor." "I'm not as good at playing as you." Jason Smith flinched. He didn't expect Julia Lopez to snap back like that. Humiliated. He lost it. What got some guy to pretend to be a doctor? Came up with some terminal illness to cover up your affair? Tears streamed down Julia Lopez's face. How had they ended up like this? Jason Smith, I really have leukemia. Jason Smith yanked her inside and loosened his tie. You really thought this through, huh? I say one thing, and you make up a whole story about leukemia. Julia Lopez, your mind's quick. I'll give you that. Julia Lopez's breath caught. Her calm, black eyes stared straight at him. Suddenly, she had no strength left to argue. There wasn't even a flicker of surprise in his eyes when she said leukemia. All she saw was suspicion and mockery. Believe me, or don't. He really is a doctor, and someone like him wouldn't go for a married woman like me. Julia Lopez said flatly, masking the weight behind her words. So that's why you want a divorce? To be single again so you can sleep around? Jason Smith's glare was terrifying. Don't assume everyone's as filthy as you, Julia Lopez snapped. Pain stabbed through her bones again, and her brows knitted. I'm filthy, huh? Maybe I spoiled you too much. Now you think you can do whatever you want, even divorce me. Jason Smith shoved her aside. No, Julia Lopez cried, turning away. Jason Smith, don't make me hate you. He paused for a beat, then forced himself on her anyway. Julia Lopez went quiet, clutching the sheets with trembling fingers. She bit down on her arm, waves of pain rolling through her. She'd always known how rough he could be, but before tonight, this man had always been careful, gentle. And now, over a stupid misunderstanding, he showed his true face. At this point, she wasn't any different from those other women in his life. Jason Smith looked down at her from above. Still want a divorce? He growled. Julia Lopez didn't answer. He scowled and grabbed her chin to force her to look at him, only to freeze, blood draining from his face. Half of her face was covered in blood. Her arm was shredded from the bite. Yet, she refused to make a sound, too stubborn to cry out. You're insane, Jason Smith gasped, scrambling to grab his phone. I'm not going to the hospital, Julia Lopez forced out. Don't make a scene. I said I'm not going, she suddenly screamed. Jason Smith stood there, stunned, then turned and left the bedroom. Moments later, he returned with a first aid kit, quietly cleaning and dressing her wounds. Julia Lopez turned to look at him, forced a small smile. Happy now, Jason Smith. His face twitched, but he said nothing. Julia Lopez didn't care. I remember when we first got together, everyone joked that you treated me like I was made of glass. I was proud, you know. Thought I chose right. Jason Smith held her fingers, his heart twisting. Stop, Julia. You said you were scared of pain, so I told you not to have kids. But I didn't think, even if I didn't, there'd still be women lining up to have yours. Isn't that right? Julia, it was my fault. Please stop, Jason Smith whispered, pulling her into his arms. He had a terrible feeling he shouldn't let her say anymore. Julia Lopez's eyes were empty, as if he didn't even exist. I knew from the start, the first time you had another woman. I held on for 3 years, because I couldn't let go of our 9 years together. But how many 9 years does a person get? So I didn't care how many women you had. Didn't care who you gave your shares to either. She pushed him away. But Jason Smith, I'm tired. I don't love you anymore. His body jerked. The fullness in his chest collapsed into a void. Julia Lopez shut her eyes. That was the end of the conversation. Jason Smith, flustered, kissed her forehead lightly. Cut ties with that guy. Let's start over. Julia Lopez opened her eyes and looked at him, almost amused. Jason Smith, how can you doubt my love for you? Her gaze must have been too sharp-frowned. You know I hate seeing you with other men. I work myself to the bone out there for. What? So you can live in comfort, and you repay me by hanging out with shady people? That was it. Julia Lopez's heart went cold. After 9 years, all they had left was humiliation and fights. She sat up, found strength from somewhere, and shoved him out the door. "Get out! I don't want to see you!" Julia Lopez screamed. Jason Smith stared at the shut door, fist tightening and loosening again. In the end, he turned and left, like a petulant child. He had his limits too. As soon as she heard the car drive away, Julia Lopez rushed into the bathroom. Slumped by the toilet, she retched like she was trying to puke out her entire insides. 10 minutes later, she stared at the blood-streaked vomit. She let out a bitter laugh and covered her face. A whisper full of despair slipped through her fingers. "Jason Smith, I'm not made of steel either. I don't have much time left. How am I supposed to face my parents like this?" The doorbell woke her up. Julia Lopez blinked in a daze. The room was dim and quiet. She couldn't tell if this was a sorrowful dream or just lonely reality. She pushed through a wave of pain and dragged herself to the door. When she saw who was standing there, she froze. "What do you want?" she asked. "You're Julia Lopez?" Latina Mera looked surprised. She had seen Julia Lopez before, only briefly, from afar, but even without makeup, the woman had been stunning. Now, Julia Lopez's cheeks were sunken, her figure ghostly. She looked like a lifeless doll stuffed into oversized clothes. And yet this was the woman Jason Smith kept hidden and protected. Feeling bold, Latina Mera handed her something. She smiled. "Look, this is Jason's baby." Julia Lopez lowered her eyes slightly, numb to it all. Not just because of the child, but because Latina Mera called him Jason. "So this starting fresh, you promised?" Julia Lopez said softly, "Was just comforting me before going home to your real family." She looked up at Latina Mera. "Is that what you came here for? To show me your bastard child?" The words sliced Latina Mera's pride to shreds. "What are you so smug about?" she snapped. "Do you even know how many times over the past 3 years President Jason said you were cold and boring? Said you clung to him like a leech back then. And now, look at you. You still think you deserve to keep him?" Latina Mera spat, her voice hysterical. Julia Lopez stared at her, almost amused. She was just about to speak when her eyes landed on Latina Mera's neck and her face went sheet white. She took a step forward and yanked at Latina Mera's clothes. Her eyes turned red instantly. She grabbed the necklace and choked out, "This? Where did this come from?" But Latina Mera had more strength than a sick woman like Julia Lopez. With ease, she snatched it back. "Jason gave it to me." "What? You broke and desperate enough to steal now. It's mine." Julia Lopez screamed, shoving Latina Mera against the wall. She didn't care anymore. She had to get that necklace back. How could she forget? Back when Jason Smith just started working. He spent an entire month's salary on a pair of matching necklaces as a gift for their anniversary. They weren't expensive, but Julia Lopez had treasured hers ever since. "Jason Smith, you gave our keepsake to her?" Julia Lopez was livid. Her eyes were bloodshot. Latina Mera wasn't backing down either. The two of them wrestled and shoved in the hallway. Ah! Latina Mera lost her footing and tumbled down the stairs. When she stopped, she clutched her belly and wailed, "My baby." Julia Lopez stared at the blood spreading between her legs, panic flooding her chest. She fumbled with her phone and dialed the hospital in a rush. When Jason Smith arrived at the hospital, he saw Julia Lopez sitting there, dazed and hollow. Her thin frame was trembling, lips tinged blue from the cold. "Go home first," Jason Smith said as he walked up. "Jason Smith, where's your necklace?" Julia Lopez suddenly asked. Jason Smith froze. Then anger clouded his face. "Do you even know what you've done? And you're still asking about a necklace? Julia Lopez, when did you become so heartless?" Julia Lopez stared blankly at him. "Yeah, I'm heartless. That's why I'm staying to watch Latina Mera wake up to a world of pain." "Julia Lopez," Jason Smith snapped. His hand moved before his brain caught up. He raised it and slapped her. Her face jerked to the side from the impact, but her expression didn't change. Only a deep, numbing emptiness filled her eyes. Jason Smith froze. In all these years, he had never hit her before. "You done? Want to get the other side too?" Julia Lopez asked, voice flat but defiant. "You're insane," Jason Smith muttered, exhausted. What happened to the warm, gentle woman he once knew? The red mark on her face made his chest twist tighter. Just then, the emergency light turned off. Latina Mera, pale as a ghost, was wheeled into the intensive care unit. A nurse said, "The baby couldn't be saved. Once she wakes up, watch her emotions closely." Jason Smith let go of Julia Lopez. "Happy now? Want to go inside and see for yourself?" The coldness in his voice made Julia Lopez shiver. She looked at Latina Mera's lifeless face. She couldn't tell whether what she felt was sorrow or emptiness. "Still not leaving. Waiting for Latina Mera to wake up and start a fight to the death with you." Jason Smith's frustration grew. "At least she has a reason to fight with me. What about us?" Julia Lopez stared deep into his eyes, then turned and walked out the door. Jason Smith's foot twitched. But in the end, he didn't follow. Latina Mera woke up in the late afternoon. When she saw Jason Smith by her bedside, something in her eyes shifted. Her voice was laced with venom. "I want justice for my child." No, Jason Smith didn't even hesitate. "Jason Smith, that was your child." Latina Mera's eyes widened as she shouted. "If you hadn't gone there in the first place, none of this would have happened. I'll compensate you for the baby," Jason Smith said flatly. "Even if I ask you to marry me as compensation," Latina Mera hissed. "You know that's not possible," Jason Smith snapped. What he hated most was people who couldn't recognize their place, always trying to climb into his life. "Maybe you don't know," Latina Mera said calmly, her eyes glinting like a serpent. "Carlos Mera is my father." Jason Smith's expression shifted. The CEO of Zhongxing? Latina Mera thought she had won until he spoke again. Then, "Let's see if your father can actually touch me." Back home, Julia Lopez locked the door behind her. The calm she'd been faking collapsed in an instant. She crumpled to the floor, biting her fist to keep from screaming loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She knew it was time to leave. 9 years. Her life couldn't end on such a pathetic note. She dragged a suitcase from under the bed. After glancing around the room, she quietly packed. There really wasn't much to take. Over these 9 years, Jason Smith had become a successful man, adored by many, but she never once chased after his fame or wealth. The only thing she ever wanted his heart she didn't want anymore. Julia Lopez put on her thickest coat, gathered her ID and bank cards. She looked around one last time, then walked out the door without hesitation. At the hospital, Latina Mera's whole body trembled when she heard his words. "Julia Lopez matters that much to you. Enough to ruin your entire reputation." "Think whatever you want." Jason Smith stood up. "Stay here and recover. When you're ready, go to HR to settle your paycheck." Latina Mera understood this was a clean break. Her voice cracked as she cried out, "President Jason, I was wrong. I'll stop all those silly thoughts. Please don't leave me." "This is it for us, Latina Mera." Jason Smith walked away, his back firm and unyielding. After leaving the hospital, Jason Smith drove to the apartment complex. He sat quietly in the car, lit a cigarette, trying to figure out what to say to Julia Lopez. Knowing her temper, sweet words might work. He had decided to cut off everything outside. This shouldn't be too hard to fix. He stubbed out the cigarette, stepped out of the car, and looked up. His gut told him something was off. It was already dark outside, so why were the lights still off in the apartment? A heavy sense of dread gripped him. Jason Smith rushed upstairs, skipping steps, and unlocked the door. Silence, not a trace of human presence. "Julia Lopez?" he called out cautiously. No response. He flipped on the lights. Everything inside was neat and in place. But that empty room, it felt like a boulder crushing his chest. He could barely breathe. Jason Smith pulled out his phone and dialed her number. It was turned off. "Damn it," he called his assistant. "Get the local precinct chief. Julia Lopez is gone." Elsewhere, Julia Lopez walked through wind and snow. The streets looked both familiar and foreign. She had no idea where to go. A wave of helplessness surged inside her. Turning a corner, she suddenly felt warmth trickling from her nose. She wiped it instinctively. Her palm was covered in blood. Panic rose, but her mind stayed clear. She tilted her head back, pressed tissues to her nose, and stood still. She thought it was just another symptom, but after the bleeding came the dizziness. By the time she realized something was wrong, she was already collapsing. There were few people on the street. She lifted her hand weakly, then fell into darkness. Jason Smith sat in his office, the ashtray in front of him overflowing with cigarette butts. He had imagined Julia Lopez, yelling, crying, throwing fits, but not this, not walking into an empty home without her. Only now did he understand what it meant to be irreplaceable. Carlos Garcia walked in. Seeing Jason Smith's face, he asked gently, "Still no luck?" "President Jason, I checked all nearby traffic cameras. No sign of her." Carlos Garcia braced for the outburst. But Jason Smith just waved a hand and said, "Keep looking." He reached for another cigarette, but the box was empty. Frustrated, he tossed it aside. Then it hit him, that guy, the one who dropped Julia Lopez off that night. "Carlos Garcia, pull the footage from the 27th Street cam outside my building." At the hospital, Tony Camel stared at the furious man in front of him, rage simmering in his own chest. "Julia Lopez is your wife. You couldn't keep her safe. What do you want from me?" But even as he spoke, Tony Camel couldn't help but wonder, why hadn't she come back for her follow-up? Was she really planning to face death alone? He couldn't explain it, but the thought of Julia Lopez disappearing from this world unsettled him deeply. He didn't want to examine that feeling too closely. Jason Smith caught the shift in his expression, but said nothing, his own questions unresolved. He pointed and growled, "You better not be lying to me." Things had already spiraled out of control. And now, it turned out this guy was actually a doctor. Julia Lopez barely knew anyone, so where the hell could she have gone? Standing outside the hospital, Jason Smith watched the snow fall and suddenly remembered something critical he had completely overlooked. He strode back into the office. "You said you and Julia Lopez were doctor and patient. Then tell me, what illness does she have?" "A small apartment in the western suburbs." Julia Lopez slowly opened her eyes, then jolted upright. The place was unfamiliar. She wasn't in a hospital. She tried to sit up, panicked, but her wrists were tied tightly to the bed. A thick wave of dread surged through her. "Is anyone there? Help!" she cried out. Just then, the door creaked open. A pale, hate-filled face appeared in the doorway. That was when Julia Lopez realized things had spiraled out of control. She frowned. "Latina Mera, what are you trying to do?" Latina Mera sneered. "What do I want? You'll know soon enough. You strip her." Julia Lopez's pupils contracted sharply. She struggled, but it was no use. Two servants quickly tore her clothes into rags. Before she could react, a camera flash went off. Julia Lopez froze in horror. "Latina Mera, what the hell are you doing? Jason Smith will never forgive you." "Oh, didn't Jason tell you? He's going to marry me," Latina Mera said coldly. She didn't wait for Julia Lopez's reaction. She turned and left, slamming the door. "Edit the photos on my phone. You know what to do." "Julia Lopez, I lost my baby because of you. Did you really think you wouldn't pay for it?" Latina Mera's lips curled into a cruel smile. Julia Lopez stared at the closed door in shock. Her voice was barely a whisper. No, Jason Smith would never do this. He wouldn't. She scanned the room, frantically searching for any possible way to escape. Meanwhile, Jason Smith was rocked by the words Tony Camel had just spoken like a thunderclap to the head. It took him a long moment to react. His voice cracked, hoarse beyond recognition. "Leukemia? Are you joking?" Tony Camel laced his fingers, speaking coolly. "You're her husband. You never noticed her body wasting away. The pale face, day after day, Did she really never tell you her diagnosis? Jason Smith stumbled back 2 steps. Every word Tony Camel said drilled into his ears clear, cruel, and impossible to unhear. Leukemia, that terrifying word. How could it be happening to Julia Lopez? Tony Camel stared at the man's ashen face without pity. Mr. Jason, Julia Lopez doesn't have much time left. Are you happy now? He threw on his coat and walked out without looking back. For 3 days straight, Jason Smith used every resource he had, but it was like Julia Lopez had vanished from the earth. The more time passed, the heavier the weight in his chest. Every time he thought about the word leukemia, a chill ran down his spine. Where could she have gone, dragging that sick, broken body? Jason Smith ran a hand through his hair, full of regret. When Julia Lopez told him, "I really have leukemia," what was he doing? He didn't want to think about what came after that. Just then, a text notification lit up his phone. He grabbed it instantly, but the moment he opened it, it felt like his blood reversed direction. It was a photo message from an unknown number. Julia Lopez lay disheveled on a bed, and the man beside her was Tony Camel. 2 sleepless nights, and his explosive rage collided all at once. Jason Smith clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth nearly cracked. Bloodshot veins crawled across his eyes. Disappeared? Leukemia? What a joke. Just an excuse to run off with her lover. Jason Smith hurled the phone across the room. Julia Lopez, teaming up with Tony Camel to trick me? You really went there? After a moment of silence, he picked up the phone and barked into the intercom. Call everyone back. Stop the search. A woman like that didn't deserve his time. If she wanted to play dirty, she couldn't blame him for doing the same. And spread the word I'll be marrying Latina Mera in 1 week. Still in the suburban apartment, Julia Lopez clutched the blanket between her teeth. Without medication, every wave of pain made her feel like she was dying. But Latina Mera's words from a few days ago echoed in her mind. She had to get an answer from Jason Smith. She refused to believe he would really throw away everything they had. Latina Mera hadn't shown up in days. Servants guarded the door constantly. There was no way out. Julia Lopez suddenly released her grip and cried out in agony. The servants rushed in, shocked by her pale face and the sweat beading on her forehead. Please, take me to the hospital. I'm begging you. Julia Lopez sobbed as she fell from the bed, her desperation enough to stir pity in anyone. I'll call Miss Latina, one of the servants stammered, then ran out in a panic. Julia Lopez stared at the wide-open door. Her body was still weak, but a glimmer of hope lit her eyes. She dragged herself up and bolted outside. But Latina Mera had been thorough. The apartment was in a remote area. Julia Lopez waited half an hour no cars passed by. She gritted her teeth and started walking. In the bridal shop fitting room, Latina Mera hung up the phone, sneering to herself. Sick? Julia Lopez. Once I marry Jason, you'll be completely irrelevant. Elsewhere, in a northern villa, a man stood reporting, "Young master, we've found the woman you were looking for." Tony Camel picked up his keys. "Send me the address. I'm on my way." Ever since Jason Smith came looking for him, the next day the whole city exploded with the news Julia Lopez was missing. And the first thing Jason Smith did was announce a wedding with another woman. Speeding down the road, Tony Camel couldn't help but despise men who didn't know how to cherish what they had. But even he was stunned when he finally saw Julia Lopez. Her face was caked with dried blood, and in the freezing dead of winter, she wore nothing but a thin knit taupe lips were blue with cold. "Doctor, please, contact my husband," Julia Lopez whispered, eyes full of desperate hope, like she'd finally found a lifeline. Tony Camel's eyes reddened instantly. He steadied his voice. "Get in the car." Julia Lopez glanced at the vehicle, hesitant. Tony Camel lost patience, got out, scooped her up, and placed her in the back seat. "We're going to the hospital first. You haven't had meds in days." Julia Lopez sat there in a daze. "I think it's been 3 or 4 days," she murmured. Tony Camel tightened his grip on the wheel and stepped on the gas. As they passed an intersection, Julia Lopez glanced outside and froze. "Stop the car," she screamed. Tony Camel hit the brakes and followed her gaze. His stomach dropped. On the giant screen outside the mall, an ad blared the joyous announcement. Jason Smith and Latina Mera were getting married. Julia Lopez stared blankly at the screen. Her voice was eerily calm. "Doctor, is that real?" Before Tony Kamel could respond, color rushed to Julia Lopez's face. Then, a surge of crimson blood burst from her mouth, splattering the car window in a horrific bloom. Julia Lopez. 3 days later, Jason Smith and Latina Mera's wedding went ahead as scheduled. Watching the woman in white glide down the red carpet, Jason Smith couldn't help thinking when Julia Lopez was with him, she couldn't even afford a dress like that. That thought hit him hard. All the effort he thought he gave was nothing more than self-consolation wrapped in a lie. His eyes drifted to the church entrance. "Julia, I'm about to marry someone else. Are you really not going to show up?" As Jason Smith stared longingly, the tightly shut church doors suddenly creaked open. Blinding light poured in. Everyone squinted except the groom, who stood there wide-eyed in shock. When he saw who it was, Jason Smith practically growled through clenched teeth. "Tony Kamel, you and Julia Lopez tricked me, and you still dare show your face here?" The overwhelming shock shattered what little grace he had left. Tony Kamel's expression remained calm, but everyone could feel the sorrow radiating off him. Holding a funeral urn in his hands, he said, "Jason Smith, I brought Julia Lopez to your wedding." Tony Kamel's words threw the entire room into an uproar. On General Manager Jason's big day, this man showed up with an urn. Was he trying to stir trouble? Did he just say Julia Lopez? Who's that? No idea. Let's see how General Manager Jason reacts. Only Carlos Garcia, seated in the crowd, looked at Jason Smith with worry. Of course he knew who Julia Lopez was and what she meant to his boss. It had only been a few days. How could a living, breathing person now be reduced to ashes? How was General Manager Jason supposed to handle that? Amid the chaos, Jason Smith roared, "Shut up, all of you." Once the room went silent, he walked toward Tony Kamel, stopping 3 steps away. No one noticed his hand behind his back trembling slightly. He glanced at the urn, then quickly looked away like it burned him. Gritting his teeth, he said, "Don't think showing up with a box like that will fool me. Where is Julia Lopez?" Tony Kamel looked at him once, then softly spoke to the urn. "Julia Lopez, look, this is the man you loved for 9 years. Even now, he still refuses to believe you're gone." Watching Tony Kamel's strange behavior, Jason Smith couldn't hold back any longer. His fists clenched. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't believe Julia Lopez had disappeared so quietly from his life. Jason Smith. Tony Kamel's face turned cold, each word biting. "Ask the woman in the wedding dress what she did to Julia Lopez. Once you know everything, come to the villa in West District." With that, Tony Kamel turned and walked out. Jason Smith, still reeling from the shock, didn't hesitate in his next move. "Wait, give me that urn," Jason Smith said, stepping in front of him. "Didn't you just say you didn't believe it was Julia Lopez's ashes?" Tony Kamel's smirk was laced with bitter irony. Jason Smith stiffened, then stubbornly repeated, "Give it to me." Tony Kamel raised the urn slightly. His voice was cold but steady. "Julia Lopez said she never wants anything to do with you again. If necessary, she said to scatter it. It doesn't matter anymore." Jason Smith stared at him in disbelief. Then, as it sank in, he stumbled back 2 steps, muttering, "No, don't. I won't take it." Tony Kamel curled his lip and said mercilessly, "Jason Smith, if you regret it now, what was all that before for? Come find me once you've cleaned up your mess. Then you'll understand what it means to be truly, utterly broken." That last line, Tony Kamel didn't say aloud. It wasn't cruelty. It was that Jason Smith had gone too far. Julia Lopez never deserved any of it. As Tony Kamel drove away, Jason Smith stood frozen in place, grief so thick it felt almost physical. Julia Lopez is dead. Jason Smith felt like a fish out of water. Every breath hurt. After a long moment, he reached up, tore the boutonniere from his chest, and turned around. His eyes were now filled with a calm, bone-deep emptiness. Standing before the priest, Latina Mera knew something was wrong. She never expected such chaos to break out at the final moment of her wedding. "Jason, let me explain." She panicked as the man approached her. Jason Smith swept a cold glance across the crowd and said calmly, "Carlos Garcia, Remove everyone except the Mira family. I'll visit each guest personally to apologize later. Though the guests were eager to see how this mess would end, no one dared disobey Jason Smith. One by one, they left the chapel in silence. Jason Smith's eyes turned sharp and cold as they landed on Latina Mira. When her entire body began to tremble, he asked, "What did you do to Julia Lopez?" "I didn't do anything, Jason. Please believe me. We're about to get married. How could you doubt me because of a stranger's lies?" Latina Mira pleaded, tears brimming. But all Jason Smith could think about was Julia Lopez, gone. He didn't care who was watching. "Carlos Garcia, take Miss Latina back. Until I say otherwise, no one is allowed to see her." Then he turned to the Mira family. "Wait until I figured out the truth." The unspoken message was clear. If Tony Kamel had told the truth, the Mira family was going to pay dearly. Jason Smith left the church and drove straight to the address Tony Kamel had given. He couldn't help but wonder those West District villas weren't cheap. Since when were doctors this rich? In the West District, Tony Kamel gently set down the urn and instructed, "A Mr. Jason will be arriving soon. Bring him in directly." "Yes, young master," the servant answered respectfully. Once alone, Tony Kamel opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. He murmured, "Julia Lopez, just like you wished. Jason Smith didn't finish the wedding with Latina Mira. Now comes the real show." Sitting by the towering window, Tony Kamel stared at the urn. A shadow of emotion flickered across his face, dark, unreadable. About half an hour later, Jason Smith stepped into the villa. The refined decor deepened his suspicions about who Tony Kamel really was. But he didn't forget why he came. He followed the servant upstairs, opened the door, and saw the urn on the table. Jason Smith's heart sank deeper. If this was just a performance, why would Tony Kamel bring something so ominous into his own home? That single thought was enough to shut down his imagination. He sat silently across from Tony Kamel. "Mr. Jason," Tony Kamel began, now cold and distant. "If I'd known how this would end, I would have told Julia Lopez to stay far away from you from the start." Jason Smith's brows furrowed, but he held back his emotions and said nothing. "The first time I met Julia Lopez, she came alone. Her illness wasn't too advanced yet, but she already looked worn down. When I saw the word married in her file, I couldn't help but wonder, where was her husband?" Tony Kamel spoke flatly, completely ignoring the storm brewing on Jason Smith's face. "Each visit, she looked worse than before, but she kept up treatment. You know why?" Tony Kamel asked. Jason Smith replied hoarsely, "Why?" Tony Kamel's eyes flashed cold. "Because she couldn't afford it. With your wealth, covering her treatment and finding a bone marrow donor would have been effortless. So why, Mr. Stepp?" "Jason, did Julia Lopez end up as ashes in a box?" Jason Smith felt something in his chest crack. Even the plush chair beneath him felt like it was made of thorns, stabbing him with every breath. "Give her back to me," he could only whisper. "Give her back," Tony Kamel sneered. "You'd better figure out the truth first." The chill in his voice made Jason Smith shiver with dread. "This is from Julia Lopez," Tony Kamel said, pushing the folder across the table, then turned and walked away. Tony Kamel didn't know how Jason Smith would react to the truth, but no matter how cruel it was, he believed it was no more than Jason Smith deserved. Nothing could match Julia Lopez's years of heartbreak. Jason Smith sat there in a daze. Whatever was in that folder, he wasn't ready. Once he opened it, there would be no turning back. Only endless nights of torment awaited. His eyes drifted to the silent urn. His Julia Lopez, the vibrant woman in his memory, reduced to this. Every word Tony Kamel had said, Jason Smith couldn't deny. When Julia Lopez went to the hospital for the first time, he had been in a hotel room with his mistress, thinking she was just boring. And after that, Jason Smith recalled her pale face. How hopeless must she have been, staying beside him like that? Who was he now, to reject the final thing Julia Lopez had left him? Jason Smith took a deep breath and reached for the folder on the table. Tony Kamel lit a cigarette. He rarely smoked, but the image of Julia Lopez from a few days ago had burned itself into his memory. He couldn't shake it. He couldn't forget her frail body sitting upright on the bed, holding a voice recorder and speaking slowly. "Jason Smith, I'm sick. Leukemia, a serious illness. I didn't want to tell you. Your heart left me 3 years ago. Telling you now would only drain what little affection we have left." I figured you'd think I'm using pity to hold on to you. And you, so proud, how could you accept that? I have my dignity too. Hiding my illness was the best choice I had. But I didn't expect Latina Mera to show up with your child, Jason Smith. I didn't even let her in. That was our home. I wouldn't let anyone else step inside. I also didn't expect you'd take my interactions with Dr. Tony as some affair. That night, when you confronted me, I couldn't hold it in anymore and told you the truth. But you thought I was lying. Jason Smith, I wish I had been lying. If I wasn't dying, maybe we could have made it. That day, Latina Mera came to me wearing a necklace. The one you bought when you first started working. Matching couple necklaces for the two of us. Could you let her wear it? When I asked you about it, you cursed me, called me heartless. Jason Smith, all my warmth went to you. And you froze every bit of it. Latina Mera lost her baby. I lost 9 years of love. You tell me who's worse off. But I never thought Latina Mera would go mad after losing her child. She locked me up in a tiny room. I told her you wouldn't let her get away with it. And you know what she said? She said you were about to marry her, that you wouldn't care about me. I didn't believe her. Then I escaped. I found Tony Camel. I asked him to take me to you. But what did I see? Your wedding announcement everywhere on, every screen, every corner of the city. Jason Smith, the only one I ever wronged in this life, was that unborn child. Beyond that, I have no regrets. If there's a next life, I don't want to meet you again. A life this painful, I can't bear it again. I'm dying, Jason Smith. Congratulations on your wedding. Oh, and don't go doing anything stupid after I'm gone. From now on, let's never meet dead or alive. The cigarette burned to the filter. But Tony Camel didn't feel it. Not until the heat singed his fingers did he snap out of the memory. Just then, strange noises came from the room next door. He recognized the sound. It only came from someone in unbearable pain. Now you know heartbreak, Jason Smith. Where the hell were you before? Tony Camel crushed the cigarette in the ashtray. For Jason Smith, all he felt was cold, pity, never sympathy. Bang! A heavy thud echoed from Jason Smith's room. Tony Camel raised an eyebrow and opened the door. "Call an ambulance," he said. Jason Smith, what you're feeling now is not even 1/10 of Julia Lopez's pain. In the hospital, after waking up, Jason Smith remained dazed and unresponsive. Thankfully, nothing urgent at work required his attention. Carlos Garcia walked in and placed a container of porridge on the nightstand. "General Manager Jason, please try to eat something." Jason Smith lowered his eyes slightly and suddenly asked, "Tell me, was I good to Julia Lopez?" Carlos Garcia turned his gaze away, caught in an awkward silence. What could one say about the private mess of the man who signs your paycheck? Watching Jason Smith now, hollow and lifeless, Carlos Garcia felt a pang of sadness but sympathy. That was a different story. Jason Smith curled his lips in a bitter smile. How could I call that good? Tell me, why didn't she leave me? Why did she stay with someone like me? The man shut his eyes, trying to hide the heat building behind them. The hospital room was silent, filled only with the sound of 2 people breathing. After a long pause, Jason Smith finally said, "Carlos Garcia, check all of Julia Lopez's medical records and hospital visits." "Yes, sir." Carlos Garcia turned to leave, only to hear Jason Smith add, "And watch Latina Mera. Don't let her slip away." Jason Smith didn't want to see Latina Mera at all. Whenever he thought of what had happened between them, he couldn't tell if he felt anger or regret. Who could he blame? He had made every choice himself. The good, the bad, the ones that hurt others. But Latina Mera had hurt Julia Lopez. That he wouldn't forgive. Once everything with Latina Mera was handled, he planned to ask Tony Camel for Julia Lopez's ashes. He would take her to see the world, one place at a time. What he didn't know was Julia Lopez had waited 3 years for his change of heart. Could he really expect she'd still be waiting when he was finally ready? It was a full month before Jason Smith stepped into their home again. A thin layer of dust had settled on the shoe cabinet. The air was colder than outside. "Julia, I'm home," Jason Smith said, holding her medical records in his hand. He stepped toward the sofa, but stumbled and fell before he could sit down. The thin sheets of paper scattered across the floor, and one word leapt out in bold red ink: leukemia. Every detail of Julia Lopez's condition stared him in the face. Jason Smith quietly gathered the pages and held them close to his chest. He slid down against the wall and, finally, let himself cry. Outside, he was present and decisive, powerful. He could never show weakness. But here, in this space that once belonged to her, he could finally fall apart. But there would never again be a Julia Lopez to comfort him. "Julia, I was wrong. I was wrong." Jason Smith curled into himself, red-eyed and choking back sobs, like a child with no sense of safety. He hated himself. When he had nothing, Julia Lopez had left her family and followed him to a strange city. He was supposed to give her a warm home, a beautiful future. But what did he do? Chased power and fame, bathed in applause, and forgot the woman beside him for 9 years. He even let someone as irrelevant as Latina Mera step all over her. What must Julia Lopez have felt, watching Latina Mera show up pregnant carrying his child while she herself was wasting away? Just the thought of it made Jason Smith's heart feel like it was being torn in two. "Julia, come back, please come back." His hoarse voice echoed through the empty apartment. "Julia Lopez, if I'd known it would end like this, I would have never touched your life. I don't ask for forgiveness. Just please, don't hate me." Jason Smith slowly pushed himself up, walked into the bedroom, and buried his face in her pillow, inhaling deeply. It still smelled like her. Clutching the pillow, the man broke down into uncontrollable sobs. It was in that moment he truly understood this time. Julia Lopez was gone for good. Meanwhile, Latina Mera was under semi-house arrest in a house in the Southern District. As the days passed, her fear gradually disappeared. Every time she thought of Tony Camel carrying Julia Lopez's urn into their wedding, she felt a wave of relief. That woman couldn't win Jason Smith's heart when she was alive. Did she really think a box of ashes would change anything? Impossible. Nearly 2 months passed, and Jason Smith still hadn't come to see her. Latina Mera guessed he was probably still dealing with the aftermath of their interrupted wedding. If Latina Mera had known how Julia Lopez and Jason Smith supported each other over those 9 long years, she would have never had such naive thoughts. Another week passed before Latina Mera finally saw Jason Smith again. The man looked noticeably thinner. Latina Mera stepped forward to take his coat, but he avoided her with a sharp motion. Watching him sit down on the sofa, expression cold and distant, Latina Mera asked, "Jason, are you still mad at me?" Jason Smith looked at her and said, word by word, "If I had the right, do you know how badly I want you gone from this world?" None of this started with Latina Mera. Jason Smith had brought it all on himself. Latina Mera stammered, "Jason, I just locked Julia Lopez up for a few days. I didn't do anything to her." "Then explain this," Jason Smith said, unlocking his phone. The fabricated photo lit up the screen. Latina Mera's eyes widened. For the first time, panic showed on her face. She stuttered, "This, I don't know." "This is your last chance," Jason Smith said, his voice numb, his heart too broken to even feel hate anymore. "Fine. Yes, I made it. If I hadn't, would you have turned your back on Julia Lopez? You two were done. Why should she still have that place beside you? What about me, Jason Smith? What about all those years I gave you? What about the child I lost? Have you ever thought about me?" Latina Mera screamed. Jason Smith narrowed his eyes. After a moment, he spoke coldly. "You were never part of what Julia Lopez and I had. I never loved you. Who are you to compare yourself to her? As for the child, even without that accident, I never planned to let him be born." What did you say?" Latina Mera's face went pale. "I said." Jason Smith stood up and looked down at her, eyes sharp. I never planned to marry you. I never loved you." With that, he turned and walked out the door. To the assistant waiting outside, he said, "The Mara Corporation no longer needs to exist." Carlos Garcia's heart skipped a beat. He nodded silently, then looked at Jason Smith's thin figure and sighed quietly. Jason Smith got in his car and called Tony Camel, but no one answered. He froze. A wave of dread rushed over him. Even his hand on the wheel began to shake. No, that's impossible," Jason Smith muttered to himself, stomping the gas and racing toward the West District villa. Seeing the servants working as usual brought him slight relief. He stepped forward and said, "Could you please inform Mr. Tony that Jason Smith is here to see him?" The servant looked puzzled. "Sir, our young master left 2 days ago. He's not here anymore." For a moment, Jason Smith's vision darkened. Staring up at the dark shuttered window on the second floor, he barked, "Where did he go?" "I don't know. I'm just the one keeping the place clean," the servant said nervously from behind the gate. Clink. Jason Smith's car keys hit the ground. His tall frame collapsed like a deflated balloon as he sank to the floor. "Tony Camel, give Julia Lopez back to me. Don't take her away," he mumbled, hands on the cold pavement, not caring who was watching. "Sir, please, don't be like this. My young master left this for you." The servant handed him an envelope. Jason Smith snatched it, and when he saw the delicate handwriting on the front, his eyes went wide. "Jason Smith, I asked Tony Camel to take me away. Don't look for me. Julia Lopez."